la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito, nada.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 7, Unmasking Imperialism, Israel's Palestinian Genocide. Long live the Palestinian people, long live Palestinian resistance, in solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Palestine, in the Palestinian diaspora. And today we're going to be exposing, breaking down the mainstream Zionist coverage of Israel's war on Palestine. Yes, not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not both sides are equally bad. No, Israel's war on Palestine, Israel's occupation of Palestine, and the mass murder of Palestinian people, which we as communists, as anti-imperialists, and even progressives should be opposing, should be fighting against. And my heart goes out to the Palestinian people who are so bravely resisting this empire named Israel. And today our good comrade is back, Flame of Liberation, based in New York City. One of my longtime comrades, one of my homies going back for years. I've been working with this comrade for many years on several anti-imperialist, anti-war fronts. And it's really great to have you back on. Comrade, how's it going out there in Brooklyn? I mean, in Queens, my fault.
Yeah, yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's good. Great to be with you. And thanks for having me on again. I wanted to mention, I didn't mention it last time when I was on the other Unmasking Imperialism. It was really an honor to be to kick off this series with you as your first guest. It was really an honor to be your first guest on this great new series you have going, Unmasking Imperialism.
That's what's up, comrade. I appreciate that. And I couldn't think of anybody better, especially on the subject of the Middle East, because there's a lot of people, unfortunately, that will be good on certain issues, but then not on others. And I feel that for me personally, you have a very principled anti-imperialist sign on a lot of Middle East and international politics. And so it's always great to talk with you. That's a beautiful blanket you have in your background, by the way. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's actually two Palestinian kufiyas, the Palestinian scarf or the Arab scarf. It's used by all Arabs in, especially in the, not so much in North Africa, but like in the continent of Asia, like Arabia in the continent of Asia, like Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. But it's especially associated with Palestine and the Palestine liberation struggle. And you have the red one and the black one. And the colors often, in the Palestinian context, the colors often represent certain factions and movements within the Palestinian liberation movement.
That's what's up. It looks very beautiful. And shout out to Comrade B-Level Ewoks Unhinged. Make sure to check everybody to check out Ewoks Unhinged. Flame of Liberation was also on that channel as well, talking about Palestine. It was a really great conversation. Shout out to Comrade Oliver Smith, James Graham, Eli, Posted in the Crib, Palestina Libre. Shout out to you, Steve Riker, Solidarity with Palestine from Michigan. That's what's up. And it's really cool to speak with you, comrade, because you're based in Queens, but just yesterday you were in the heart of the Palestinian diaspora. You were in one of my favorite neighborhoods in New York, Bay Ridge, which has such a rich history of not only Palestinian, but Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern resistance and revolutionary organizing. Before I get your reaction to the protests that were going on there, I just want to share with you all some of the images of what took place in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. It was a very beautiful scene to see people, not just Palestinians, all people coming together in solidarity with Palestine. So those are some of the images. Shout out to Reply for posting that. It's really cool to see that in Brooklyn and New York. I'm from New York. You know, both of us are born and raised New Yorkers. I'm from Queens. Both of us are from Queens. Brooklyn is a very beautiful area. There's a lot of Palestinians. There's a lot of people from the Middle East and occupied Palestine there. And it's cool to see the diaspora, not only in Brooklyn, but all over the world, mobilizing, organizing in defense of Palestinian lives. What was it like? You were actually there yesterday, so tell us a little bit about how it was like being there.
Yeah, it was a massive, really massive demonstration. I don't know if I've ever seen anything like that before. In 2014, I was active in 2014 in Palestine protests when Israel was doing massive onslaught against Gaza in the summer of 2014. And I'm not sure if there was anything as big as yesterday. It would have been then. There were some huge ones then. But this one yesterday may have been bigger than any of the ones back in 2014. Right now, I'm in my mid-20s. So as far as like Palestine activism, the earliest I go back to is like 2013, 2014. But from what I hear from like some activists that are older than me, is that like in the early 2000s, there were like insanely massive protests. Like before, and in the 90s, I guess, like before 9/11, there were huge, like unimaginably massive Palestine demonstrations in New York City. But I think this, as far as like in more recent times, like I think this is definitely the biggest and possibly bigger than the demonstrations in 2014. And like you said, it was a huge group, all different people. And since it's in it's in part of Brooklyn where there's a lot of Palestinians, a lot of Arabs, a lot of Yemenis, a lot of Palestinians, a lot of Yemenis, a lot of Egyptians, some Syrians, all different people. And it's cool to see like there's a lot of Yemeni flags there as well. Some Lebanese flags and different Arab flags, as well as people from other nationalities. You saw some Colombian flags there, and I saw a Mexican flag there, and a lot of people there support from different backgrounds supporting Palestine. It was really cool to see.
That's what's up, comrade. And just to give everybody an update on the latest, just today, Sunday, this is what, Sunday, May 16th. Just a few hours ago, Israeli airstrikes on Gaza City killed at least 42 people and destroyed 3 buildings, 42 lives that were lost today. And today they're saying was one of the deadliest attacks in the latest round of Zionist Israeli violence against the Palestinian people. According to most estimates, at least 188 Palestinians have been killed in the airstrikes, including 55 children and 33 women. At least 1,230 people have been wounded. And this is a low ball. I imagine these figures are much higher because you can imagine how much chaos and destruction and how many people are being untreated, how many bodies are under rubble. So I'm sure this figure is much higher. And in comparison, 8 people in Israel, or quote unquote Israel, have been killed in what they claim are rocket attacks launched from Gaza, which I have questions about myself, which is a whole nother discussion. And so look at these numbers, 188 Palestinians versus 8 Israelis. You can't compare the two. And again, this is probably a lowball estimate for people in Gaza because we're talking about one of the poorest, most oppressed regions on the face of the planet. It's a giant open air prison that we're talking about. People being enslaved and encircled in their own land. And so it's just really disgusting to see that. And so just today, as we're speaking, we have one of the worst attacks on the Palestinian people. And this kind of gets to our main point that I think we'll go into discussing today is that we have to move away from framing this as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because every day that I've been following this in mainstream media, all of the headlines begin with Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what that does is that by placing both sides on an equal footing, by making it a conflict and not a war of aggression by one side against another, you're making both sides seem equally responsible. You're making both sides seem equally powerful when one side, Israel, which has the backing of the biggest empire in the face of the planet, the United States, which gets over $38 billion of military aid from the US over 10 years and has I think the biggest recipient of US foreign aid than any other country.
Has nukes.
It has nukes. Exactly. It even has nukes. It has control of the media. It has everything. It has all of the weaponry, not just military, but ideological, the media, everything is in favor of Israel. And they're attacking a poor and oppressed nation like Palestine that has no army, right? It barely has media of its own because even foreign media were bombed. You know, I saw something that I think Al Jazeera and AP where their offices were blown up. Mm-hmm. And so just to think that like framing it as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that in itself, the second we're getting into this discussion, we have to stop there and we have to begin to tell people, no, this is not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I say that this is an Israel's Palestinian genocide. And that's why we're calling that this episode just that, Israel's Palestinian genocide. Conrad, what do you think about, what are some of the discussions you've been having about how we frame this?
Yeah, I think that's great how you framed it and you broke that down really well. It's extremely important. And I think an important thing is also to emphasize that the Palestinian people have a right to defend themselves. The media and the politicians are always saying Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, Israel isn't defending itself. Israel is the aggressor. Israel is attacking, not defending. And the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. Palestinian people are occupied by Israel under international law, even the laws that the U.S. and the imperial powers claim to uphold. Even according to those laws, Palestinians have every right to defend themselves. So I think that's a very important point to emphasize. And also always just pointing out that what's happening in Palestine didn't just start last week. It didn't just start last month. Didn't just start last year. This has been going on since 1948, and it's all within the historical context of what's been going on since the start of the genocide of the Palestinian people by Israel.
And even visualizing it, Comrade B-Level from Ewoks Unhinged said, Flame of Liberation posted a really powerful picture of a Palestinian boy throwing a rock at a massive Israeli tank. It really manifested how the violence actually looks. And I think that's a great example of the disparity between both sides. A young boy with nothing but a rock or a slingshot versus Israel with its sharpshooters, its tanks, its weaponry. It's a completely uneven war, uneven conflict, if you want to even put it that way. So I think that is a great example to visualize, because that's something that people around the world can understand. And even looking at parallels around the world, we see that this Zionist ideology, again, another thing I want to kind of point out before, it's something that I hate to have to even mention, but it's something we always have to mention as anti-imperialist when we talk about this, is that there is a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And often a lot of Zionism is a political ideology that was started in the 1800s in Europe. It's a European ideology by Theodor Herzl, who is, I believe, French, and he was a French Jewish person who wrote a book, or German or French, one of those, but he was European, and he wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish state, where he basically came up with the concept for, quote unquote, the modern state of Israel. And he, in his writings, writes some really disgusting things about the peoples of the Middle East, the Arab peoples, the Palestinians. And it's an example of chauvinism and arrogance by the Israelis, who believe that they are a light to the world, who believe that they will save and liberate and develop the area from savagery, from dark. Just even the terms that they use, it's so racist. Like, they use the terms like Israel's a light upon nations, a light on the darkness. And it's like, who are they talking about, right? They're talking about Arabs, they're talking about Muslims, Middle Easterners. And so I highly suggest, check out that book for yourself, Judenstaat. Theodor Herzl, the founder of the quote unquote state of Israel, who founded the World Zionist Congress and eventually the State of Israel in 1948. He writes some really disgusting stuff about Muslims and Arab people in that book. So take a look out for that. We're going to go into some of the historical aspects of Israel and Palestine, because I think that's not really discussed enough. And Comrade Flame of Liberation has a lot of good historical insight into the region. Before we do that, I just want to play a clip. This is from an interesting YouTuber, Corey Gill Schuster, who has a project called the Ask Project in occupied Palestine. And in this clip, he talks to Israeli settlers and he asks them, why do you steal Palestinian land? And some of the responses, just to give you a sense of how these people think, how these people view Arab people, Muslims. So let me just see if I can play this.
Israel, God give us this area. Good teacher for new immigrants.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
Yes, I had people like you when I first came here.
Yeah.
Okay. Why do you steal more and more Palestinian land?
Why what?
Do you steal more and more Palestinian land?
We steal. They steal our life.
But you came here, they were living here, and you came here and took land.
In the history, we lived here before that. Look at the history, not 100 years. A lot of years. God give us Israel. God give us this area. We didn't steal them. We didn't hate them. They hate us. Really, I appreciate them. We let them to live here, but they want to kill us. It's from the Bible,
למה אתם, יהודים, גונבים יותר ויותר אדמות של פלסטינאים?
לא, אתה לא רציני.
אתה אמיתי עם השאלה הזאת?
זו השאלה שבאה מחו"ל.
ארץ ישראל זה מדינה יהודית. אנחנו לא גונבים, הם יכולים לחיות פה, וזה לא אמור להפריע לנו. הם אומרים שיש, נגיד, בגבעה שלוחים שעושים
התיישבות חדשה, משהו, מקום חדש, שזה זה היה האדמה של פלסטינים.
זה לא האדמה שלהם.
איך אתה יודע?
אני אגיד לך, הפלסטינים הם עושים מה הם רוצים פה. הם הורגים, שוחטים, עושים מה הם רוצים. הם לא אמורים להיות פה במדינה הזאת, חד וחלק, זהו.
איפה הם אמורים להיות?
במקום שמתאים להם, לא פה. פה הם באים, עושים מה הם רוצים. יבואו, יחיו איתנו כמו בני אדם, תפדל, לא יחיו איתנו כמו בני אדם, שילכו, חפשו את החברים שלהם. אתה מבין? אתם רוצים לחיות פה, מה אתם באים עושים מה שאתם רוצים? תבואו, תחיו כמו כולם.
So the question is, why do you steal more and more Palestinian land?
Why what?
Do you, Israelis, or Jews, steal more and more Palestinian land?
Okay, because we're not stealing, it's ours. It was our birthright in the Torah. God gave it to us and it's our land and we were here. And the fact that we were thrown out doesn't mean it wasn't ours, and it's ours because it's our given God right.
Okay, so let's take that to, let's pretend there's a situation where there's a Palestinian living on some hill or there's a village here. Is it your right to go just take it away from him and you live there?
I don't think so. We don't take away land from Palestinians, but they can't.
Oh, that's what they think. That's the idea.
But they can't prove it's theirs any more than we can prove it's ours. And I don't think that's ever done. The Palestinians are knocked off their land. The opposite is done. Jews are taken off of their home right land more often.
Can you give me an example of that part?
Oh, Gush Katif.
Oh, in Gaza.
Right. Okay, that's one. And in our backyard, there's different areas that keep being built and being knocked down.
Jewish areas.
Jewish areas. Monthly. I'm done.
למה אתם, מתנחלים, גונבים יותר ויותר אדמה פלסטינית?
אני לא חושב שאנחנו גונבים אדמה פלסטינית, זה אדמה שזה שלנו עוד מלפני 3,000-4,000 שנה שהובטח לנו, לא באיזשהו גנב, העובדה שהם הלכו ולא קמו ומנסים לקחת לנו את האדמה הזאת, העובדה שהם קמו והלכו, זה גם
מי קם והלכו?
הפלסטינים, ובואו ננסה לעשות...
רגע, מתי?
בואו נעשה שתי השחזור בהיסטוריה, הירדנים היו פה לפני כביכול שקם מדינת ישראל, קמו הירדנים היו פה והיה פה מלחמות, זה לא שהם היו פה ושלטו והיה להם, זה לא היה שלהם, זה היה תמיד בשליטה של מישהו אחר. מדינת ישראל תמיד הייתה במלחמות מכל העולם שהיו... אבל
נגיד, ניקח דוגמה של מעלה אדומים, היו פלסטינים פה לפני?
אני לא יודע, אני פה בסך הכל 5 שנים במעלה אדומים, אני בירושלים במקור, ותמיד יגידו לך, היו פה או לא היו פה, זה מלחמה שתמיד אפשר להתווכח עליה.
אם היה הוכחה, שאני לא יודע באמת אם היו, כי אנחנו באמצע, מעלה אדומים אמצע מדבר, אז אני לא יודע אם היו, נגיד בדואים או משהו, נגיד שהיו, מה אתה אומר על זה?
אני לא יודע, אני לא יודע את ההיסטוריה כל כך עד הסוף שאני יכול לענות לך תשובה.
Why do you steal land from the Palestinians?
This is a question related to history, yeah? And stealing is not the word, it's conquer. We conquer. Every state, every nation in the history conquered. So we conquered the territory of the Arabs. They left, so now it's ours. Now they want to take it away in their own way. It's fine by me.
Okay, so what do you mean it's fine by you?
It's fine by me if they want their territory back, so they fight for it. If they bomb, how they bomb, they kill, their own way.
So you can even understand?
Yes, I can understand.
Okay, so what do you think should happen then? How do we stop, if let's say the goal is to end violence,
Okay.
how do we do that?
Like we as a people, we as a country, we as a government.
Whatever you think.
I don't know. We want to hold the land, yeah? I don't want to release my home. So I think the fight will never end.
Crazy stuff. She says the fight will never end. And it just shows, I mean, I feel like the reoccurring theme is two things that I've noticed is A, we've been here before them, right? Which maybe we can go into talking about that claim. And B, this constant victim narrative. They always want to be the Zionists, the Israelis always want to be the victim. They always want to be the ones who are being attacked because that's the only way that they can continue to expand their settlements and their occupation of Palestine. And so they need that sector of society to attack them, to make them feel like victims, so that they continue that spell that they're so oppressed, that they're the underdog, because they want to be the underdog. The Palestinians are the underdog. And this goes back even to the analogy of David and Goliath. You know, we can talk about Goliath being one of the Philistines, where in the Bible you hear the term Philistine, who are the Palestinians, the people who have lived in that land in Canaan for thousands of years before the Israelites. And David, representing the Israelite, defeated Goliath, who was portrayed as a giant, as a bumbling idiot. And David was like this, you know, this guy. And so I don't know, what do you think, Comrade Flame of Liberation, based on that video?
Yeah, it's always interesting to see like what the Israelis, Zionists have to say for themselves, and see different perspectives within what they view of like the whole situation. It's pretty interesting. I think you really hit the nail on the head. Like it's sort of a very twisted, brainwashed narrative, like a totally inverted version of reality, where the aggressor, the colonizer, is somehow the victim. And this is often the case. You know, you look at the settler colonies in Africa, like in the South African apartheid state, or so-called Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. The colonizers, the imperialists, they're always acting like when the indigenous people fight back and reclaim where they actually successfully reclaim their territory, they say, "Oh, we're being oppressed. This is anti-white racism," and in this case, it's anti-Semitism. It's sort of the same sort of thing, where when the oppressed actually defend themselves, the oppressor, the colonizer, comes up with this propaganda narrative to make it seem as though, oh no, we're actually the real victims. But as far as the facts, pretty much everything that, I mean, they all said sort of different things, but the narrative that's sort of repeated by many of them is that, oh, we were here first, is total nonsense. Yes, of course, there were Jews there, but they're acting like all Jews are the same.
Right.
Jews in Europe do not speak a Semitic language, They had no connection to Palestine. They had nothing to do with that land. Of course, Arab Jews and Middle Eastern Jews, Jews from the area, are totally different. Of course, the Jews living in Palestine before obviously have every right to be there. But what was happening was, with the Zionist movement, even before the creation of Israel, the Zionists were pushing massive numbers of European Jews and Jews from all over the world who had no connection to Palestine into Palestine. And it's funny, it's funny to see the different types of narratives they try to come up with to justify that they're victims. I think that's the underlying one, and that's sort of the underlying myth of Zionism, that the land is supposedly it's really theirs, and it was usurped by Arabs, and that's just a total myth. My favorite lie that the Zionists tell, that I think is the stupidest, and it's the funniest, is there is no such thing as Palestine. There never has been a Palestine in history, which is that's hilarious, because when the British were occupying Palestine, what they called it? It was the British Mandate of Palestine. The word Palestine is well recorded without history. Even the European, Western imperialists use the term Palestine. Palestine, I mean, how insane do you have to be? How propagandized do you have to be to try and claim that the word Palestine is just made up by Arabs nowadays to try and steal the land from the poor Israelis? Going on with that, I remember once in 2015, when there was an Israel Day parade in New York. There's usually like a counter protest, and most of the people there tend to be Jewish anti-Zionists from the Neturei Karta, who are like really religious Jews who, from a Jewish perspective, say that Israel is totally against Judaism. So I was there, and a number of other people were there as well. And I remember, this is in 2015, I remember, so the Israel Day parade is going by, and then on the other side, there's like some lunatic Zionists with signs. And I remember, this is the funniest Zionist sign I've ever seen. the Zionist is holding up a sign that says, Palestine was invented by the KGB.
Oh my God.
That was the funniest Zionist propaganda I've ever seen.
That's insane. And that the irony of that is crazy because like that's one of the points of view that I disagree with the Soviet Union during that time period in allowing not allowing, but just kind of like the role it played in the creation of the state of Israel after World War II. That was actually one of the points that I'm sure you as well have similar sentiment about the Soviet position on the state of Israel. And the irony of that, right? It's like, this is something that, and there's a big difference, like you said, I'm glad you mentioned the difference between Jewish people and Zionists. And shout out to Anthony Monroy, by the way. Shout out to Orlando. Orlando said, I recommend that everybody check out a documentary by Max Blumenthal called Killing Gaza. He put it up for free the other day. That's a great documentary. I have mad respect for Max Blumenthal. Yeah, he has some really great work. Yeah, he has some really good work. Steve Richter said he saw it. Connor Gillis, shout out to Connor. Good comrade. He said, this Jew supports Palestine from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. That's what's up, Connor. Yeah, that's exactly what it's about. I mean, it gives a bad name. It's like we always have to disassociate a radical. I think a great example is like here in LA or in southwestern United States, there's a big Mexican community. My family's from Honduras. And during the migrant caravans, there have been some unfortunate racist or xenophobic things said by Mexicans against Central Americans who have been crossing Mexico to head to the U.S. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to associate all Mexicans with the xenophobes who were against the Central American migrants, because I know that's not reflective of all Mexican people. It's certain people in the Mexican government or certain class of Mexican people. And so that's something that we always have to understand. And shout out to Joe the Red. Hey, Ramiro, Nick, is Joe Gale. Keep the good comrades of ours. We got to have a reunion in New York one day. I got to head back out there and we all got to chill sometime.
Yeah, Joe the Red. Yeah,
Joe the Red.
It's a good comrade going back a while. Yeah.
Shout out to Joe on Long Island. And yeah, I mean, it's just really great to make this distinction because anytime people will say that, Ben Shapiro, who we'll play a clip of a little bit later, he's one of those classic people who, if you in any way criticize Israel, he calls you an anti-Semite. He says you hate Jewish people, and it's completely the opposite. Before we go into some of that, I wanted to ask you, Conrad, why don't you tell us a little bit about going into 1948, we have the creation of the State of Israel. 1948, David Ben-Gurion declares the State of Israel. What was the role of Israel in attacking the pan-Arab movements, Baathism, the Palestinian movements? Give us a breakdown of that time period, because I think there's a lot of interesting events that took place from 1948 to about the 1990s, right? Because we had the SixDay War, Israel attacking Syria and Egypt, Syria also attacking the PLO. Like, what happened to the PFLP? Why don't you give us a breakdown of that time period?
Sure, yeah. Well, like you said, the State of Israel was founded in 1948. And again, going into sort of the mythology that the Zionists and the mainstream media pushes, there's this myth that we could have had peace with the Palestinians, but the Arabs just attacked us from day one, and it was because of the Arabs that we had war, and it wasn't us. We just wanted peace, and the UN said we could split the land and 2 states, and it wasn't our side that wanted violence. It was the other side that wouldn't accept us. Well, the first part to that is, who was the UN to tell Palestinians that they needed to get out of part of their land and go to another? Who was the UN to tell the Palestinians to give up part of their country at all to a bunch of largely foreigners from Europe who had no connection to the land whatsoever? First of all, there's that. And then there's, second of all, before the First Arab-Israeli War, which was in 1948 at that time it was between Israel, the State of Israel, and the Arab monarchies, the corrupt Arab monarchies, as well as a lot of Arabs who volunteered to fight against Israel. That's what the Zionists often point to say, look, from day one, the Arabs were attacking us. But what totally disproves that is the fact that before the First Arab-Israeli War broke out, the Zionists were committing massacres of Palestinians all over Palestine. Most notably, the Deir Yassin massacre of April 1948. April 1948, that was before the First Arab-Israeli War. The First Arab-Israeli War was May of 1948. April 1948 was the Deir Yassin massacre, and in other places, the Zionist terrorist organizations were massacring Palestinians. And finally, eventually, even the corrupt Arab monarchies decided to try and do something to stop the massacre of Palestinians and the theft of the Palestinian land. So it's a total lie that Israel came with good intentions and peace, and that it was just the Arabs who wouldn't accept us. No, from day one, the Zionists were committing massacres of Palestinians before any other Arab country tried to intervene. The Zionists were massacring Palestinians, and the Arab response was later and totally in response and defensive to the Zionist killings and massacres of Palestinians. So there was the First Arab-Israeli War, which eventually came about. And again, it was the corrupt monarchies. And I think that the weakness of the monarchies in confronting Zionism gave a big impetus to the Arab nationalist and Arab socialist movements. And eventually Nasser came to power in Egypt, overthrowing the corrupt pro-Western monarchy. And later, Nasser, of course, being a pan-Arabist, wanted to unite all the Arab lands and liberate Palestine, and was a socialist and closely aligned with the Soviet Union. Israel and the West hated him and wanted to destroy him and his government. And eventually there was the Suez Crisis of 1956, where Israel, France, and the UK attacked Egypt. And I was mentioning this when I was on the live with Ewoks Unhinged, YouTube channel, that was a very interesting and unique period in relations between the U.S. and Israel, because that was actually a point where the U.S., it was like the only time when the U.S. actually disagreed and opposed Israel. And in so doing, they actually sided with or agreed with the Soviet Union and Egypt, which is a very unusual situation in the Cold War. But basically, the U.S. told Israel, France, the UK to stop attacking Egypt. And that was the position of the Soviet Union as well, to stop the UK, Israeli, and French attack on Egypt. And that was really an interesting sort of a turning point in Western imperialism, because that was basically the point in time where the UK and France were finally no longer the leading imperialist forces, and the US took up the mantle of European colonialism and Western colonialism in that. And then eventually there was the Six-Day War in 1967. And that war is extremely significant because that was where Israel occupied ended up occupying a massive increase in territory, including Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, which is in Syria, which Israel still occupies to this day. And Trump somehow, in his insane ultra-Zionist mind, decided to recognize Golan Heights as part of Israel. But the Golan Heights will never be part of Israel. It's always going to be part of Syria. And a lot of the inhabitants of the Golan Heights are Arabs, and they don't accept Israel there. And there was sort of a tangent, but viewers might find this interesting. In 2015, going into the Syrian civil war and the imperialist intervention in Syria, Israel's very big on the forefront of trying to overthrow Assad. So the Golan Heights has been a big area for Israel to attack Syria. And so in 2015, they were carrying in so-called Syrian rebels, Al-Qaeda basically, to take to in ambulances. And some, I think they were Druze, which is an ethnic group, Druze civilians in the Golan Heights, attacked the IDF ambulances and killed these Al-Qaeda terrorists that were getting aid from Israel. So the Golan Heights is a very interesting, significant area, and Israel ended up occupying it in 1967, as well as East Jerusalem. Israel ended up occupying East Jerusalem, which is very significant for what was going on just now with the Sheikh Jarrah clashes and Israeli attacks on Palestinians there. And also interestingly, in 1967, that's when the USS Liberty incident happened, which the US government, US media tries very carefully to cover up, because that's an incident where Israel actually deliberately attacked an American ship and tried to do it as a false flag to blame Egypt. And if it ever does come up in like the mainstream, it's always portrayed as though it was an accident. But
Right.
the U.S. sailors on the ship know 100% it was a deliberate attack. Anyone who looks into it, it's very clear that it was a deliberate attack by Israel. They did numerous flyovers beforehand. They attacked the ship for hours, and the radio transcripts between the Israeli pilots and their commanders shows specifically that the Israeli pilots knew that they were American ships, and were double checking with their commanders to say basically, this is an American ship. Is this correct? Is this a correct target? So they knew 100% it was an American ship. The Israeli officer said, yes, attack it. And they attacked it for hours. It was a deliberate attack to try and sink the ship and blame Egypt for it. They were unable to sink it, and unable to successfully pull off the false flag to try and get the U.S. to attack Egypt. But that's a very interesting thing that's very relevant for Americans to know about, that is very much covered up. And then, so that's 1967. Then another significant date is 1970, which is called an incident in Jordan called Black September, which is where the Jordanian government, it was a monarchy, a pro-Western monarchy, but for a while they had tolerated the Palestinian resistance, the Fedayeen, the PLO organizations, to operate like a base area out of Jordan. But in September 1970, Black September, the Jordanian government did a huge crackdown on Palestinians and drove them out of Jordan. And that was a very significant point in basically exposing the Jordanian government as on the side of Israel. And then a little bit after that, 1973, was the October War between Israel and Egypt and Syria. And also Iraq. Ba'athist Iraq at that point sent a contingent of forces to help defend Syria from Israeli aggression. And the Iraqi forces fighting in Syria are very noted as being very effective and very honorable in how they came to the defense of Syria in that war. But unfortunately, that at that point in Egypt, it was no longer Nasser. New leader had taken over, Anwar Sadat, who after this war basically normalized relations with Israel with the Camp David Accords, and took Egypt out of the fight against Israel, and was seen as a major betrayal of the Palestinians and Arabs in general, being that Egypt is on the forefront against Israel. How could they possibly, make positive relations with the enemy, Israel? It was a huge betrayal, and that was basically a big mark on Anwar Sadat, for everyone to see that he was a traitor and an enemy of the Arab liberation struggle and against Muslims. And eventually, Anwar Sadat was actually assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood some years later after that. So then another significant point after the 1973 October War is the war in Lebanon in the 70s and 80s. And that was between Lebanese far-right forces and Palestinians and Lebanese left. And the Lebanese far-right forces were aligned with Israel, of course. And they call themselves, they're different factions, but they call themselves the Phalangists.
Interesting.
And, or in Arabic, the Kataib Party. And it's sort of interesting. There's a little confusion around this. Some they weren't like phalangists in like the Spanish like fascist sense of phalangists. I think the reason they call themselves that is because there's this term in Arabic called Kataib, and pretty much all the militias call themselves Kataib, say Kataib Hezbollah or Kataib something else, like that's like the like organization. But this group called themselves Kataib, the Kataib Party, and I guess Kataib translates into like phalange or something like that. And so they weren't like ideologically phalangists like in Spain. In Spain, phalangists are like this weird so-called national syndicalist thing.
Yeah.
The phalangists in Lebanon were like right-wing Christian capitalists, like this really stupid. But they actually did have, even though they weren't like ideologically connected with the phalangists, they're an old party going back to the 30s, and they did have connections with the fascist states, Spain, Italy, and Germany. So I think it is fair to call them fascists, even though ideologically they're just sort of like far-right capitalist scumbags.
I want to stop you right there because that's a really interesting parallel with Latin America, because around this time period, right, we're talking about the 70s, right? And there was also in Latin America, Israel was at this moment beginning to ramp up its support for right-wing Christian military governments in Latin America, especially Guatemala and El Salvador, where Guatemala was the first Latin American country to recognize Israel as a state. There's a huge right-wing evangelical base that supports Israel in Guatemala that was killing indigenous Mayan people who were communist guerrillas organizing against the Christian right-wing government. And also in El Salvador as well, with the Arena Party, the National Republican Alliance Party, which received weapons, training, arms from Israel. Same thing in Honduras as well, in Central America, as well as in the 70s and going into the 80s, the Somoza family in Nicaragua and the Contras, they were also backed by Israel, trained by Israel, a lot of the weapons they got from Israel. And we see this connection between right-wing Christian Zionism and capitalism in the non-Middle Eastern parts of the world with Zionism in Israel. So it all comes full circle. It's all connected, and a lot of times people tend to view this only as a hyper-local or Middle East thing, but this is like an international thing where you have right-wing Guatemalan Christians talking about, we need to kill these quote-unquote polytheistic savages that they called the Mayans, and we need to do this for Israel. It's some really crazy, and they were trained in Israel, and a lot of the Enrique Rios, Efraín Rios Montt, who was the right-wing dictator of Guatemala in the 80s, who carried out some of the worst massacres, he was directly inspired by what they were doing in Israel against Palestinians, against the Lebanese people. So there's so much historical parallels that are not really talked about,
Yeah, I think that's so true. Israel's involvement in Latin America, supporting the right-wing forces all over the place in Latin America, South America, and they're not confined just to Palestine or the Middle East. Like you said, Latin America, they're very involved in supporting reactionary right-wing forces. Also in Ukraine, they're aligned with neo-Nazis in Ukraine, which is, it's just another example of how, this argument that, Israel, it's to defend Jews. We defend Jews all over the world. Total bullshit. They work with neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And historically, some of the Zionist militias call themselves Zionist fascists in their own words. So the Zionists, they don't give a damn about Jews internationally. And they'll work with neo-Nazis in Ukraine who want to kill Jews. And they'll, they really don't care. And in fact, going deeper into that, some of the founders of Zionism, some of the early Zionist leaders were saying that they support anti-Semitism and that Zionists should support anti-Semitism because it's very helpful to the Zionist movement, because if there's hatred and violence and hostility towards Jews in Europe and elsewhere, then that's, from the perspective of the Zionists, that's great for them, because then they'll be more willing to go to Palestine because it's a hostile environment where they are. So the Zionist movement really, they don't give a damn about Jews internationally. And their international involvement, in Ukraine, I think is a perfect modern example of that.
It's wild.
Yeah. But yeah. So
Yeah, that time period is really interesting. So now we're like around the 70s, right?
Yeah, 70s, 80s. And I also want to emphasize that even though in the Lebanese Civil War, it was between these far-right Christians and Palestinians and Lebanese left, there isn't really, in the Arab world, there isn't a conflict between Christians and Muslims, despite there's this whole Zionist and neocon and evangelical bullshit to try and make Muslims and Christians into enemies. But if you look at it, some of the founders of the Palestine Liberation Movement were Christians. The founder of the PFLP, George Habash, is a Christian. You could tell by his first name, George. George Habash was a Christian. Many other leaders within the Palestine Liberation Movement, the PLO organizations, so-called terrorists, what the Zionists call them, were Christians. And a lot of the Lebanese left were Christians. In Iraq, Ba'athist Syria, so many Christians in the government, high-ranking Baathists. So there's this absolute myth and propaganda that Christians and Muslims are enemies. And especially in the Arab world, Christians and Muslims, for the most part, have worked together to fight against Zionism. And in the Lebanese Civil War, this is sort of an unusual case. And it's only really these Maronite Christian far-right people. And it wasn't like Christianity versus Islam. It was these far-right people who claimed to be Christians fighting against people who were Muslim and Christian as well, because a lot of the Palestinians and Lebanese left were Christians. So anyway, Lebanese Civil War. And Syria was also involved in the Lebanese Civil War, and that's sort of a confusing situation because at first in the Lebanese Civil War, Syria wasn't supporting the PLO. They were against Israel, but they were not supporting the Palestinians. Later, I think they sort of came to a better understanding, but that's sort of a blemish that people often bring up against Syria and Assad, is that in the Lebanese Civil War, Syria was not supporting the PLO and the Palestinians. But generally, of course, Syria supports the Palestinian resistance, and certainly nowadays, no doubt about it, Syria supports the Syrian and Lebanese resistance. So that's the 1970s, the Lebanese Civil War. Oh, and of course, why were they in Lebanon? After Black September, a lot of the base area for the Palestinian resistance was pushed out of Jordan, Black September in Jordan. And many of them went to Lebanon. And already before that, there were a lot of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. So, and then at the end of the Lebanese Civil War, unfortunately, again, the Palestinian resistance was pushed out of Lebanon. And eventually there was the first Intifada in the late 80s and early 90s, which was a huge uprising of Palestinians all over Palestine. In protests and armed uprising altogether, all different forms of resistance against Israel. And eventually the Oslo Accords came out of that, where Yasser Arafat recognized the state of Israel. And that is seen as like a major, a lot of people say that that's when Yasser Arafat sold out. I don't know if it's necessarily fair to say if he sold out. It was certainly bad that he did that, but I don't think that necessarily takes credit away from all of his decades of struggle against Israel before that. But that's an important period. When the Oslo Accords were signed, and of course, not all the organizations within the PLO supported that. Like the PFLP, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, which is a communist organization. They were part of the PFLP. They're part of the PLO, and they to this day do not recognize the state of Israel. And some other organizations within the PLO do not recognize Israel and advocate for resistance against Israel. So then there was the second Intifada in like 2000 to 2005, which is again a huge uprising of Palestinians. And in 2006, there's another war in Lebanon, in the summer of 2006. And this was where Israel was fighting against Hezbollah, as well as Lebanese Communist Party and Palestinian organizations. And this is a major event because Israel was kicked out of southern Lebanon. and this was a huge. This was a huge blow to Israel, and this was a huge morale boost for the Arab world and Islamic world to see Israel defeated by these resistance groups, not even like governments or national armies, but resistance organizations drove them out of southern Lebanon. And that was really the 2006 War of 2006 really put Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance on the map internationally as a force to be reckoned with. So that was 2006, the war in Lebanon. Then there was the Israeli onslaught against Gaza and the very end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, which was a huge attack against Gaza by Israel. Then again in 2012, I believe in November 2012, Israel did a big attack on Gaza again. Then in 2014, there was a massive Israeli onslaught against Gaza again, and this is probably the biggest onslaught of Israel against Gaza. The one going on now seems like, unfortunately, is going to become even bigger than that one. We'll see. But up until that point, the 2014 onslaught against Gaza had been the biggest one yet. And since then, between 2014 and now, Israel has actually bombed Gaza many times, on and off, not as high intensity as 2014, obviously, so it never really got like the same amount of media coverage. But since 2014, Israel actually has consistently bombed Gaza on and off. And Israel has also been constantly attacking Syria, bombing Damascus like countless times since 2011 and since the war started in Syria. But I think that basically, I think, gives a good coverage of like sort of the history up till now of the Zionist criminality and the Palestine liberation struggle.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview, and that's something that we're not going to see that in mainstream media. I think of all the articles and coverage I've seen in mainstream media, none of this breakdown has been given, even in terms of the USS Liberty. And the second you even mention it, people are like, oh my God, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're crazy. They would never do that. It's like, nope, they've been doing that shit for many years. They probably pioneered that. And even when we look at Syria, the so-called gas attacks, all these false flag attacks that were carried out, that years later on, it was revealed that they were all fake. You know, Israel played such a big role in that strategy and creating, because they understand, I think, and that's why Mossad as a spy agency for Israel is so powerful, because they understand how to use the media to create fear. Because what is the best way to mobilize people? Fear. When you get people scared, when you get people in a position of anxiety and fear, when you have what seem to be rockets in the air, what are reported to be rockets in the air, and you scare the crap out of people and you make it seem like there's this enemy constantly trying to come at you, you are able to control people. You're able to get people. It's kind of like 9/11, right? After 9/11 happened with the Twin Towers and everything, the U.S. was able to mobilize that fear to invade Iraq, Afghanistan, countries that had nothing to do with what was going on. And also, on the other hand, the other side of the coin is trauma bonds, right? The Zionists know that by having their own killed, by having Jewish people killed, they can use that as an excuse to bring people together, to bring a fake sense of unity among people, to reproduce that spell over and over again in the media, which they have a very strong role in. And even I've been seeing a lot of Muslim YouTubers have been kicked off of media. I think Munar from Minpress News, unfortunately, was kicked off of, I think, Facebook. And so we're seeing this happen. Like, we're seeing, if you in any way question Israel, if you in any way question the official Israeli narrative, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're anti-Semitic, you're crazy, you know, and this is why this war is on so many levels. It's not just bombs and drones and attacks. It's like ideological, spiritual. There's so many components to it. And so before we wrap up, it's been really great talking to you, Comrade, as always. I just want to play a little bit of a video that Ben Shapiro, our favorite person, our favorite commentator, who's very deeply embedded into Zionism. I mean, look up this guy's background. His family is really invested in the state of Israel for many years. It's kind of creepy, actually, to really look into. And he's one of the top, quote, conservative political pundits and podcasters out there. So I just want to play this clip from this video that he put out a few days ago, basically justifying Israel's attack. So let's hear from that now.
Over the course of the last 36 hours toward the most populated areas of Israel. There are onlookers who are shouting their celebration. They don't care who they kill. Okay, they fired 200 rockets that landed on their own people. They don't care. Overnight, hundreds more rocket attacks on Israel by Hamas, which is a terrorist group. A little bit of history for you. Hamas is an openly genocidal group. They have said over and over and over that they wish for Israel not to exist. This is not a conflict over land. This is not a conflict over borders. This is not a conflict over a right to return. This is a conflict in which one side wishes to destroy the other side utterly and completely. And this has been their long stated goal. And they were about to win an election, by the way, in the West Bank, which is the reason for all of this. The recent history here is that in late April, Mahmoud Abbas, who again is a terrorist, Mahmoud Abbas, treated as a legit world leader by much of the world community, but is not. Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, which is a terrorist organization, but a slightly less terrorist organization than Hamas, he had declared that there would be elections in April, the first elections since 2004. He is now in the 16th year of a 4-year term, Mahmoud Abbas. So he declared elections, then it appeared he was going to lose. So he canceled the elections in late April and blamed the Jews, because this is what you do if you are a Palestinian leader who is suddenly got their feet to the fire. So Mahmoud Abbas cancels the election, he blames the Jews, and he starts ramping up calls for violence. Hamas, not to be outdone, because the way that you apparently garner support is to show that you hate the Jews even more than the guy next to you. Hamas decides they are going to ramp up the violence. This all culminates in violence on the Temple Mount, spurred by Hamas, spurred by Fatah, people using the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a holy site to Muslims, as an actual staging base to perform acts of terrorism and violence against police officers, Israeli police officers. And then when Israel goes in to stop that, then the rocket fire begins from Hamas, which has decided to up the ante. So, number one, let's just recognize a quick truth. None of this would be happening right now in terms of this heavy rocket fire from Gaza if Israel had not unilaterally made the concession in 2005 to pull out of the Gaza Strip completely. Remember, Israel had Jewish areas of the Gaza, there were Jewish areas in the northern Gaza Strip. There were these little cities in the northern Gaza Strip. They had greenhouses. They were quite prosperous. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew in order, supposedly, to push for a new peace deal. The idea was going to be, look, Israel is giving up this land, and now it's another stone in the wall of peace that's going to be built right here. Instead, Hamas immediately rushed in, burned all the greenhouses, and then started building up its rocket bases for use against the state of Israel. And what this has resulted in is most of Israel is now under the umbrella of terror. From the north, Israel is under the umbrella of Hezbollah, which is an Iranian-backed terror group in Lebanon. They have apparently 150,000 rockets. If you think it's bad right now with Hamas firing hundreds of rockets a day, wait until it's Hezbollah firing thousands of rockets a day. And then from the south, they are under assault from Hamas, a terrorist group located in the Gaza Strip. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is located in both Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. So Israeli citizens basically live under the constant threat that at any moment things could go up in flames and all of a sudden they could be living underground. So I was texting with a bunch of friends in Israel last night who were literally texting from bunkers. Many of them had been giving 45-second, 60-second, 90-second warnings to get underground as soon as humanly possible, because the fact is that Israel is a tiny, tiny country. Okay? And it is a tiny country surrounded by malevolent countries that do not wish it well. This is why the Trump breakthrough in terms of actually creating alliances and helping to foster alliances between Israel and places like the United Arab Emirates and places like Sudan and places like Morocco, why this was such a good thing. The Biden administration immediately blew it. Okay, so there are a few events that led up to this. One was Abbas canceling the election and then having to demonstrate to the Palestinians that mostly it was Israel and we need to blame Israel and let's have a competition as to who hates Israel most. It's also a smart move by Abbas in the sense that Hamas, in going all the way in shooting rockets into Israel, was going to be also the chief recipient of Israeli return fire. So Abbas is basically having the Israelis do his dirty work by killing off all of Hamas's leadership. So this is one of the things that's happening as well. The other thing that happened is that the Biden administration, upon entering office, immediately signified that it wanted to push Israel into making concessions to these terror groups, that it would restore funding to the UNRWA, which is an agency specifically dedicated toward fostering Palestinian extremism, that the United States would restore $290 million worth of foreign aid to the Palestinian Authority, much of which would be used for terrorism and fostering of terrorism. Okay, so the United States basically reopened the door. The Trump administration said no. we are making very clear who our allies are here. And if you engage in terror, the money ain't coming your way. And things were calm and things were quiet. And then the Biden administration came in, and within months, you have this massive conflagration, which is now on the verge of all-out war. And the reason it's on the verge of all-out war is because Israel literally has millions of its citizens now living underground. Okay, so to understand this conflict, the thing you really need to understand is the map. Okay, so there are a few maps I'm going to show you right now. The first map shows you the actual range of fire from Gaza. Okay, the distances from the Gaza Strip to various Israeli cities. Okay, what you will see here is that the distances are tiny. Israel is a tiny postage stamp of a country. The distance from Gaza, the Gaza Strip, which is located in the southwest corner of Israel, the distance from the Gaza Strip to Ashkelon, which is a city that has been under steady rocket fire over the course of the last 3 days, is about 13 miles. That's the distance, 13 miles. The distance from the Gaza Strip to Tel Aviv, this was considered a long shot for Hamas until recently. That distance is about 44 miles. Okay, not a long, less than an hour car ride, significantly less than an hour car ride. The distance from Gaza to Jerusalem, which is sort of in the center of the country, is only 47 miles. From Gaza to Ashdod, it's 24 miles. Okay, what does this mean? It means that when you fire rockets, people have pretty much no warning. Okay, here is a map of the warning times when a rocket is fired. Okay, if a rocket were to be fired from essentially Gaza to Ashdod, you'd be talking about at most 30 seconds of warning time. If you're talking about Gaza to Jerusalem, you're talking about 1.5 minutes of warning time, about 90 seconds of warning.
So he goes on. I'm not going to play the full clip, but it's all premised on this idea of the missiles. If we even believe that, we have to really look into that, because honestly, I looked at the video of the Iron Dome and the rockets, and something didn't look right to me. I'm going to continue looking into it. But again, the victim narrative, and he constantly, and a lot of Zionists I have heard do this, where they point to the size of quote unquote Israel as being a small country, as somehow representing their power or their strength. And it's a play on words, it's a spell. Because even though, yes, technically, the quote unquote state of Israel is a small geographic area, that doesn't mean it's small in terms of military strength. That doesn't mean it's small in terms of power and might. It means that they're just small geographically, you know, and it's one of those play on words where if you repeat it often enough, we're a small country, we're a small country, we're a small country, you start to visually think of it as a weak country or a poor country. But it has nuclear weapons, like you mentioned earlier. It has the biggest technology, weapons, the support of the biggest imperialist powers. So I don't know, what do you think, comrade, about Ben Shapiro's analysis?
Yeah, Ben Shapiro, it's always a good laugh anytime he opens his mouth, because he's such an idiot, to put it lightly. I mean, first, it's hard to figure out where to start. But first of all, I guess I could start with his whole lie that, oh, Israel just so benevolent. We just gave up Gaza. We don't want to conquer Palestine. We just gave up Gaza. Well, you're kind of missing the fact that Israel was illegally occupying Gaza, even according to the United States, even according to the biggest supporter of Israel in the world, the biggest backer, biggest bankroller of Israel in the world, the United States. You were illegally occupying Gaza. So you didn't just give it up out of goodwill. You weren't just being nice. No, that was illegal and that was against international law. So you didn't just, that was fine. You did something where you actually abided by international law in that case. So it's not like you just gave up Gaza out of the goodness in your heart. You were illegally occupying it at that time period. That's number one. Where else to start? Oh, and another thing is funny. Whenever these Zionists talk about these groups, they always deliberately mispronounce the groups. They say Hamas, Hezbollah. Well, it's not spelled with a KH. It's just spelled with an H. They have, they sound like complete idiots.
Right.
Hamas, Hezbollah. It's
right.
Hamas and Hezbollah. It's pretty simple. You don't have to overdo this stuff. They sound like complete idiots.
Right.
What else was he saying? He was saying that Mahmoud Abbas, who is considered by most Palestinians and most people who look into the situation, was basically a puppet of Israel. basically, his so-called government, the Mahmoud Abbas government, basically all they do in the West Bank is operate as neo-colonial puppets, as police force for the Israelis. It's much better for the Israelis to have so-called Palestinian police arresting Palestinians than have Israeli military actually do it. So that's the function that Abbas and the so-called Palestinian Authority really does. That's really all they do. So it's hilarious for him to be calling the puppet of the Zionists an anti-Semitic, anti-Israel terrorist. It's just so insane. It would be like if Trump started calling the South Korean government like puppets of North Korea. So or like if during the Cold War the U.S. started saying that the West German government was subservient to Moscow. That sort of insane twisting of reality. So there's that. I'm trying to remember what else he was saying. Again, it's all premised on this lie that Israel is the victim. Like you were saying, you emphasized the point that he was the propaganda point he was making, which is that, we're a small country, we're a postage stamp of a country, whatever he said, and he showed the map, and we are constantly underground because of these rockets. Well, what happened to your Iron Dome, Ben? I thought you guys had an Iron Dome, state of the art. What happened to that? I guess you guys aren't as invincible as you claim to be, if we even believe these stories about rocket attacks to begin with.
Right.
And as small as the state of Israel is, Palestine in reality, so-called Israel is, Gaza is even smaller. Mm-hmm. Gaza is a very small piece of land, incomparable to Israel. The state of Israel, so-called Israel, is way bigger than Palestine is, and they don't have underground shelters to go to. In Israel, occupied Palestine, the Israelis have shelters all over the country. They actually have somewhere they can go to. In Palestine, it's all Palestine, but in Gaza, they don't have anywhere to go to. And that's why, like earlier, you brought up the comparison between the deaths for Israelis versus Palestinians. There's no comparison. You could count the number of Israelis who died on your hands. You could count the number of Palestinians who die in the hundreds, and before it's over, unfortunately, it's probably going to be way higher. It's totally imbalanced. There's no comparison between it, and that's something. How would someone like Ben Shapiro explain that? The fact that way more and incomparable amount of Palestinians are being killed than Israeli citizens. There's no comparison whatsoever. And there's also the fact that Israel is the aggressor. He wants to this is the trick that they always play. Whenever something happens, they say, history just started today. Mm-hmm. Hamas just started attacking us for no reason whatsoever, except they want to kill all the Jews, which is what he claims that they stand for. They just want to kill all the Jews, so they started attacking us for no reason today. Well, actually, no. Israel was attacking Palestinians in East Jerusalem and trying to ethnically cleanse the area of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. And they attacked the Al-Quds, and they attacked in Al-Quds the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a huge provocation, huge attack against the Palestinian people. An insane level of aggression on the part of Israel. They fired tear gas, stun grenades, arrested people in the mosque. You're attacking one of the holiest centers in Islam that is dear to all Palestinians, whether you're Christian or Muslim. And then they closed the mosque. And again, this was during the time of Ramadan, a very important time, the most important part of the year for Muslims. And the Palestinian resistance group of Hamas warned them that if they do not end their illegal activities in Jerusalem, they would respond. Now, here's the thing. According to the Zionists and the imperialists, the mainstream media, Israel always has the right to respond to anything. But Palestinians never have a right to respond to anything. Israel is attacking Palestinians in Jerusalem. Why don't Palestinians have a right to respond? And that's what the Palestinian resistance did. They gave an armed response to what Israel is doing. If Israel does an armed response, not even an armed response, armed aggression, bombs Syria for no reason whatsoever, Syria is not attacking them, the media has no problem with it. But when Palestinians fight back, when Gaza fights back in support of the Palestinians in Jerusalem, all of a sudden it's, they want to kill us all. They totally detach it from reality. And that's how these people's propaganda works. They have to compartmentalize these events to try and take them out of their context completely, don't give you a full picture of what's going on, to try and propagandize people. But I think it's not really working, because sentiment against Israel in the U.S. and around the world is really shifting against Israel. Before, like during the Cold War, there was a lot of sympathy to the state of Israel by the U.S., but now with the new generation, our generation and younger, it's becoming so blatant what Israel is doing with their armed, all-out onslaughts against civilians in Gaza and their attacks like what they did in Jerusalem. It's just becoming so blatant and harder for them to cover up.
Yeah, it's becoming obvious. People don't want wars. People don't want to get into more conflicts abroad. There's so many problems here in the U.S. as it is, with poverty, infrastructure, that the U.S. could be fixing instead of engaging in these overseas imperialist wars. And even with that Ben Shapiro clip, it's just interesting because him and a lot of the evangelicals who claim to be pro-life, who claim to be in favor of saving babies and saving lives, all of a sudden when it's Palestinian babies and Palestinian lives, they don't give a fuck, and it's so clearly obvious. And it just shows their arrogance, their chauvinism, their superiority complex. And I've had that experience with Israelis, with Zionists. I mean, I grew up in New York. Like, I've come into contact, especially in Queens. Like, we're both from Queens. There's a lot of Zionists, not even just quote unquote Israelis, but like I've come into contact with like Central Asian Zionists from like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, who are more Zionist, or Russian Zionists, people who believe in the superiority of Israeli and Israel. And they just have this arrogance, this chauvinism. Their line of sight is so narrow. They only care about Israeli lives lost. They don't give a fuck about anybody else. They only care about them, because that's what really counts. Because they see themselves as worth more than a Palestinian life or a Muslim life or an Arab life. And that's fundamentally what it's about, and it shows that it's so evident, because he's, Ben Shapiro and these evangelicals and Zionists, they talk about, we need to save lives. I'm pro-life. We need to save the babies. What about the Palestinian babies being killed? What about the Palestinian kids and families that are being bombed? They don't give a fuck about them, because they don't see them even as human. They don't see them as equals. And it goes to the fundamental arrogance, the chauvinism, the racism of Zionism, of this belief that they are the chosen nation. As the people in the clip earlier were talking about, God gave us this land. We're the chosen people. And again, this is not reflective of Jewish people as a whole, but people who believe in Zionism, which is a political movement, not a religious or ethnic, originated concept. And so it's been really cool to talk to you, Conrad. I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. Everybody, please go and subscribe to Flame of Liberation. Anti-imperialist activist has some great content on Baathism, the Middle East, DPRK. We got to do another stream about the DPRK soon, because I know definitely are very well versed on the DPRK. Shout out to our comrade Joe the Red. Shout out to our comrade B Level with Ewoks Unhinged, who you were on. Make sure to check out that stream as well. It was a really great stream with another comrade. I forget his name, but the three of you guys were having a really great conversation about Palestine. Long live Palestine, from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. Thank you all for watching and listening. Shout out to James. Shout out to Steve. Shout out to everybody. Long live Palestine. Peace out, comrade. It was really great to talk to you.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
Take care.